seminar series. We're really happy to have Josh this morning presenting on Hollywood storytelling. Josh is a DPhil in the School of Geography, and he worked as a production intern at The Daily Show a few years ago, I think. He can tell you more about that. And then he spent several years studying screenwriting. And recently he published an article in Nature explaining how he's taking this experience from story writing and applying it to his scientific career. So I'll let Josh take over.
Great. So hello, everyone. So let's just jump right in, I think. So let's talk about two movies that came out last year, back when we could go into the theater. So I don't know if anyone saw Cats. I actually did not see it myself, but what's remarkable about it to me is that it has probably the lowest score I've ever seen a movie achieve on various websites. And that is despite having all the stars and a production budget of almost 80 million pounds. And just for a bit of fun, here are a few of the reviews that I'll never forget reading. Oh God, my eyes will haunt viewers for generations. My favorite one, a doctoral thesis could be written on how this misfire sputtered into existence. So another movie that came out last year was Parasite, and I did see this one, and I think a lot of others have as well. Now, this is a movie from South Korea, and on a production budget of 7 million pounds with actors who are relatively unknown, at least in the West, this movie went on to win all the awards and accolades. So clearly storytelling, and this is pretty obvious, storytelling can be done well and it can be done poorly. So what does that have to do with science? Well, sort of quietly in the background in the research articles, there's sort of been a shift, I'd say over the last 10 to 15 years, a greater recognition of the importance of storytelling for science communication. And there's loads of evidence that stories, by which I mean, not just presenting fact after fact, but including characters who go on some kind of journey, can be persuasive, aids in learning. It's even being used for sort of climate change and vaccine communication. So it's really powerful. But something I've noticed, having worked in the entertainment industry before I became a researcher, is that there's sort of the sense that we have to invent storytelling from scratch, where we could be learning a lot from the actual storytelling professionals who have done this for decades, if not centuries, really. And I focus here on Hollywood because as an American, and that's my limited perspective, which I want to point out right now, but also because they have these huge budgets for these films and a lot of money is on the line on a story. So a really interesting book by Ed Catmull. I'm going to actually move that there. Great. This is sort of an inside story of how Pixar came about. And Pixar I'm going to use as a key example in this talk because they're really story scientists. Here is a photo from the writer's room of Inside Out, which I imagine many of you have seen. And you might notice this actually really looks like a lab group meeting. You have lots of people collaborating, they're running experiments, and they're using peer review to assess each other's work. And ultimately, they end up with this fantastic product through that process. And that is a very scientific kind of mode. This is something I've been thinking about, and I've done this workshop about more than 10 times now, and I recently wrote about in Nature on this process. So what I'd like to do for the next 15 to 20 minutes is give you just a little taster of these storytelling principles. These are, if you picked up any of these sort of screenwriting how-to books, these are the kinds of rules and principles you'd find. Now, I just said rules, but really, of course, these are guidelines and there's always exceptions. But when writers are working with millions of dollars on the line, they often refer back to these principles. So I'm going to speak for the next 15 to 20 minutes and show a few videos, and then we're going to do a little bit of a conversation based on an exercise I've put together, and then we'll just have an open discussion. So unless there are any questions right now, I will just jump in. Great. All right, starting most basic. Once upon a time is, the foundation of every fairy tale and story you ever heard, but it's remarkable how often we forget to ask ourselves why we are telling a story in the first place. We all have that friend, or maybe it's ourselves, who really kind of struggles to tell a story. You know, they go on and on and on, and you're kind of like, okay, what's the point? And this happens to movies and film and television shows all the time. You're like, where is this going? So before you even tell a story, you've got to figure out, okay, what is the point here? What is the significance? Now, getting into the actual story itself, what is the best way to start your story? Think about all the films you've watched and all the television shows you've turned on. And it's no accident that the first scene is usually some action-packed scene. There's a lot going on. You don't know, you don't really understand. And that's a very intentional move by screenwriters to hook you. And what is it? It's not so much about the action, but more about the question, right? Because in your brain, you're like, what's going on here? I'm going to keep watching this film until I figure out what the backstory is. And I have a few screenshots from Christopher Nolan films, who I think generally does this in every single thing he produces. Right, and that's something that's pretty familiar. But how do you apply this? So let's just use an example of climate scientists who are looking at ice cores, right? So they're reconstructing the temperature for the last 10,000 years. A good strategy for them, especially when talking to the public and not just to experts in their field, would be to start their talk not with a graph like this, but talk about their expedition for field collection. Talk about the adventure of it, and show how they're how they're doing this. And that raises a question in the audience's mind. What are these scientists doing all the way up in Greenland in the middle of nowhere collecting ice? And then with that sort of hook, you jump into the data. And it's really not that much effort, but it sort of flips it on its head and catches people. And I actually did it in this very talk, and I try to do it in every talk. I opened with an anecdote. I could have just started with my main thesis, but I instead talked about these two films and contrasted them. And hopefully, if my theory is correct, that helped grab your attention as well. So on to the third principle. I'm going to play a video now. So this is Matt Stone and Trey Parker. They created South Park and the Book of Mormon musical, and they have a rule which I have found very helpful. So let me just, and Cecile, if you could just let me know if the sound is working, or if it's not working, rather. Here we go.
Okay.
Just hold right here. Don't move.
Please welcome the Emmy Award-winning and Tony
Nervous. I don't know why I'm
creators
nervous.
of South Park, Matt Stone and Trey Parker. You think I'm kidding, right?
Yeah, they were. Hey! Our whole South Park writers' room, one whole wall is one of these. And we've got it split up into 3 acts.
We have
where
different
the
colored
commercial
markers
breaks
just
up.
like here too. Look at.
Yep.
We have that.
And I walk around with the markers like this, and we'll go, okay, we do a show about
This
this.
is
I was
basically our writer's room.
Oh, okay, well somewhere, okay, this would be a funny scene if we had this.
true.
Each individual scene has to work as a kind of funny sketch. You don't want one scene that's just like, well, what was the point of that scene? We found out this really simple rule that maybe you guys have all heard before, but it took us a long time to learn it. But we can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words "and then" belong between those beats, you're f***ed, basically. You got something pretty boring. What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word "therefore" or "but." Right? So what I'm saying is that you come up with an idea and it's like, okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No, it should be this happens, and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. And that, as soon as we are able to, and literally sometimes we'll write it out to make sure we're doing it. We'll have our beats and we'll say, okay, this happened, but then this happens, and that affects this, and that does to that, and that's why you get a show that feels like, okay, this to that, to this to that, but this, here's the complication, to that. And there's so many scripts we read from new writers and things that we see.
God, I see movies.
And
that-
yeah,
you see movies that you're just watching. And it's like this happened, and then this happens, and then this happens. That's when you're in a movie, just going, "What the f am I watching this movie for?" Just like this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. That's not a movie, you know. That's not a story. Like Trey said, it's those two, but because therefore, that gives you the causation between each beat, and that makes that's a story.
Yeah.
Great. So that should be pretty straightforward. in terms of the rule, but sort of what does this mean for sort of us as sort of researchers? Let's talk about how you might put together a research proposal or even an abstract, right? So you read a lot that are like, researchers did this, and then prior researchers have done this, and then they found this. We thought about this, and then we realized we could run an experiment that did this, and blah, 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 blah. You can help isolate the key factors using this therefore but rule. Prior researchers have looked at this, but there is this research gap, therefore our study fills this gap. And that's just very straightforward, and it's actually useful for brainstorming. It's something I've been using as I work on my DPhil, just to isolate what is the key story here, that where does my study fit into that story. There's a scientist named Randy Olson who does a lot of sort of communications stuff these days, and he does some work with this if you're interested in that. Okay, so I could talk an entire separate talk really about the hero's journey, but you may have heard of this. It's from a very famous thinker and mythologist named Joseph Campbell. Basically, it's a theory around sort of story structures that go across different cultures. It inspired Star Wars and all these other films and artists. The key thing that you need to know from it is a good story has character growth. As the character goes through, or characters go through some adventure, they change. Yeah, there's another theory that is built upon this by the creator of Rick and Morty. But the key thing to remember is research actually fits this model incredibly well. So research, as all of us know, has lots of twists, failures, big successes. It's really quite dramatic if you can think about the story in this way. So when you're talking about your research, instead of just presenting, here's what we found, people actually engage a lot with how you reacted to those discoveries. You know, did it meet your expectations? What were the surprises? Did it sort of change who you are even, or change your understanding of the world? Those are the kinds of, beyond the actual data itself, those are the questions that people find really, really fascinating. So next on, character flaws. I've attended a number of writing workshops, and they're often talking about how do you make a compelling character. And the thing that comes up time and time again is character flaws. So you have Indiana Jones, and he's sort of this superhero kind of figure, but he's afraid of snakes. And that's something Steven Spielberg put in very intentionally. Fleabag, which is such a popular show, she's a deeply flawed character. Yet we actually connect with them because we are flawed. And I thought it'd be fun just to show a clip from WALL-E and how using the character flaw principle, you can even connect with a robot that doesn't talk. Great. Yeah. So I also kind of wanted to show that clip just to give you all a break from your working lives, just to watch some Pixar for a minute or two. But yeah, it's a remark. If you watch the first 20 minutes of that movie, there's not a single line of dialogue, and it's just absolutely brilliant storytelling. So you may have seen this TED Talk. I think it's one of the most viewed ones of all time, about the power of vulnerability. And the mistakes you've made, the failures in your research actually make great story material. And I think, the scientific enterprise is so focused on positive, or at least results that are valuable or change how we understand the world. But in terms of a storytelling perspective, these sort of experiences are actually really great material for you. Okay, a few more to go. Save the Cat. This one's kind of a fun one. A lot of screenwriters are well aware of this, and it's a bit controversial, but it's an interesting theory around how do you make an empathetic character. And the classic example by the writer who wrote about this theory, the screenwriter, talks about Aladdin. So I don't know if you guys remember the first scene. Aladdin steals the bread. He runs from the guards. What happens next? Well, he gives the bread to homeless children. When they originally wrote Aladdin, he just stole the bread and ran away. And they were wondering why, when they ran it with test audiences, why do audiences not like Aladdin that much? They added in this little manipulative scene, and all of a sudden you're rooting for Aladdin. And it is manipulative, and I see it constantly. These are just two movies I've watched in the last week, and I could just go on and on. I was rewatching the old movie You've Got Mail. Tom Hanks actually plays kind of like an evil character. He's this big business owner who's going to close out a small business, and they needed to balance out this sort of evil character. So they gave him a cute dog, and he pets the dog. I was watching Knives Out last night, and the main character, you see her taking care of an old man extensively in the first few minutes. And again, I'm not saying you have to insert a cat or a dog into your presentations, but as people who are working in the biodiversity field, you have loads of opportunities to show cute animals or yourselves or other conservationists working with wildlife. And really showing this, even just showing a photo alongside your talks or in your writing, can really resonate with people. And is it manipulative? Yeah, we can talk about that. I would say all screenwriting is audience manipulation, but it's something to consider. Okay, and on that note, when we're talking about characters, something I see a mistake that's done a lot by NGOs, and something I've tried to help them with through various consulting things, is don't start out with the big information, the statistics. It's with coronavirus, we see it, talking about how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people affected. It's hard to understand that. Start with the individual story, and then people can extrapolate from that to a bigger phenomenon. So this is actually really well documented in psychology. It's called the identifiable victim effect. Sorry about the noise. I think a neighbor is drilling upstairs. But here's an example of it. So a colleague of mine, he does work on climate lawsuits. And essentially, when he gives his talk, he likes to talk about this case of a Peruvian farmer who is suing a German energy company. And that sort of gives you a sense of, okay, what does this look like at the local scale? And then you can extrapolate that out to global climate litigation. Almost there. So writers are often thinking about structure, and they're there's a lot of emphasis on putting in stakes. So as the action builds in a story, you need to keep rising the stakes to show why this is important. And when it comes, let's go back to the abstract we put together before. So we use the but therefore rule. Therefore, our study fills this gap. And then you want to raise the stakes. Therefore, our study has implications for this. It's essentially just reminding you, try to, when we're digging deep into the data, look outwards to show the significance of this. And I've been asked, what about basic research or fundamental research that's not really going to change the world? You can definitely phrase that in the same way by talking about the importance of curiosity and the unexpected technologies we've gotten from fundamental research. So there are always ways of showing the importance of our work. Finally, I'm not going to show the video because I think we're running low on time now, but comedy can be really useful and engaging. And the more important thing, and I think probably relevant for a lot of your work in biodiversity, when we're talking about loss of species or habitats, it's actually very depressing, as all of you know. And we need to remember that that can be rough on audiences. So balancing that out where we can is really useful. I want to use a case study now, and this is where I want to open the floor in a moment. This, I'm sure most of you have seen this 2 years ago, this Greenpeace palm oil ad, and I'm well aware that the science isn't perfect on banning palm oil. I'm sure Yadvinder in the call could talk about that more, but this ad went so viral. And what I want us to do is watch the ad, and I want you to pay attention and see if you can spot any of the principles I mentioned. And let's see if that can help us find out why this ad was so popular.
There's a orangutan in my bedroom and I don't know what to do. She plays with all my teddies and keeps borrowing my shoe. She destroys all of my houseplants and she keeps on shouting, ooh. She throws away my chocolate and she howls at my shampoo. There's a orangutan in my bedroom and I don't want her to stay. So I told the naughty orangutan that she had to go away. Orangutan in my bedroom, just before you go, why were you in my bedroom? I really want to know. There's a human in my forest and I don't know what to do. He destroyed all of our trees for your food and your shampoo. There's a human in my forest and I don't know what to do. He took away my mother and I'm scared he'll take me too. There are humans in my forest and I don't know what to do. They're burning it for palm oil. So I thought I'd stay with you. Orangutan in my bedroom, now I do know what to do. I'll fight to save your home and I'll stop you feeling blue. I'll share your story far and wide so others can fight too. Orangutan in my bedroom, I swear it on the stars. The future's not yet written, but I'll make sure it is ours.
Yeah, speaking of being aware of your audience's emotional reactions, I'm sorry if I've made everyone depressed now, but maybe we could, if anyone's willing to share if they spotted any of these principles in this ad.
I'll kick off. You can certainly see the first act hook there, the mystery of this, what this orangutan is doing, running around in the bedroom. That's just the very Christopher Nolan style there.
Exactly.
And the character flaws, you saw a lot of that.
How so?
I guess it's just the playfulness of the orangutan, just breaking everything.
Right. And also the girl who doesn't really understand yet about her products and the impacts too.
Yeah.
Right.
The cute animals.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I think you've got, sorry. I was just saying, I think you've got the Once Upon a Time model because you've got Emma Thompson's voice, which she does, you know, that kind of lulls you into childhood. And then she sort of talks in a rhyme that makes it feel like you're back to being a kid and that this is a story.
100%, yes.
And it's a human, or it's one single orangutan, not a whole population.
Exactly. It starts with the single orangutan in the room, and then they expand out to the species as a whole. That's exactly right. Any other ones that people want to mention?
You have the hero's journey with the little girl aiming to make a difference.
Exactly. Exactly. This was a transformative moment for her when she realized the environmental consequences of the products, right? Exactly.
And you've got Save the Cat, because you've got Save the Orangutan.
Exactly. Absolutely. I would also say, you know, there's a bit of comedy in here too. It's kind of funny in the beginning before they get really dark. The therefore but is very clear. It's a very short ad actually, relatively at least. And it's very clear what's going on. I think you've hit all of them actually that I wanted to say. Yeah, raise the stakes.
Raise the stakes, yeah. They do raise the stakes because at the first he's destroying the bedroom and then you realize the stakes is the whole rainforest.
Any other thoughts on this ad from anyone else from a storytelling perspective? Why you think it may have resonated so much? And there are some politics around the television bans and things, but I'm talking here really about how they structured the video.
I think that lurch from being very comic to being very dark in just one shot was quite, oh wow, it's very powerful.
Exactly.
It's very powerful for children, and so it's kind of making the case incredibly black and white. There's no real room for children growing up having seen that to then question the science.
Exactly.
So emotionally engaging.
And I also think really fundamentally just the seeing things in a different light, sort of, I never thought of it that way kind of contribution.
Exactly. Absolutely. It's meant to be like an eye-opening video. And in fact, the video seems to be, it is so powerful that it may have, I know there's a lot of critique from the scientific community because a lot of scientists argue we shouldn't ban palm oil, but we should be going for sustainable. But that's, I guess, a separate issue. Yeah, so.
There's also something about identification.
How so?
You put yourself, I mean, you're not looking at it out there. You're somehow in there with it.
That's right. Yeah, and a big part of storytelling, I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but there's a lot of research around mirror neurons, and that when we watch a story, we're actually in our brains experiencing we are feeling the process of the main character. So I think that's an interesting point as well. Great. So just to give a few takeaways. First of all, this is just a taste of various screenwriting principles and rules, and there's a lot else out there, but I hope it gives you a sense of the kind of techniques that writers are thinking about in the writers' rooms. So I would argue that storytelling can be very useful in your career, especially for writing and teaching and lectures, but also if you're doing interviews with the press or interviews even for jobs and explaining your own research journey. You also don't need to sort of invent storytelling from scratch. There's a lot out there. Simply looking up some screenwriting stuff on Google, or even just paying attention when you watch something and ask yourself, what are the writers trying to do in this film? How are they manipulating me? And what can I learn from that? And these principles are, once you learn them, they're really not that hard. It's not that hard to add an anecdote to the beginning of your talk. And you probably had one somewhere else in the talk. And it's just a matter of shifting it up to the beginning to hook people in from the beginning if you believe in that principle. And I think it gives you a lot of value for relatively low effort. So I hope you'll consider this in various ways you can apply it, and we can just talk about it now, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
So do you want us to take questions from the...
Yeah, so I'm happy we can just have a conversation about it. And if people have questions about working in science communication, I'm also happy to answer that, because that's what I was doing for a few years before my DPhil.
That was my question, actually.
Okay.
Just to talk a little bit more about careers in science communications, and I think it's an exciting field at the moment. So can you tell us from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as researchers or individuals with training or background in sort of science, you can use that expertise to help communicate in ways that those who don't have that expertise can't. So you're more aware of things that are going on, and if you practice, you can learn how to translate those findings in ways that the public can understand. My role before the DPhil was working with the organization that published the journal Science, and I was part of a department that was trying to translate these findings in an advocacy context, trying to fight for science funding in Congress. So we really had to think about how can we make these findings understandable and engaging, and we often use storytelling to try to illustrate that. There's loads of opportunities now these days, especially in the social media world. Yeah, if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to answer that as well.
I'll let everyone else speak, but do you have any example of a tricky story that you managed to make engaging?
Let me think about that. Yeah, again, I think I don't have a specific example that's coming to mind, but I think a major breakthrough for me was encouraging scientists to talk about their field collection and sort of field work at the beginning of their talk, because there's a lot of interesting adventure kinds of elements in there. Yeah.
Okay. Would anyone like to ask a question, or you can also ask it in the chat if you want?
Well, while we're waiting for people to ask questions, I'll just give a comment. Thanks, Joss. That's absolutely terrific, and I learned a lot from that. But I also recognise things that I hadn't realised work well when I give a talk that I feel happy with and things there. I like that tension at the start and various themes there. But I guess exactly what type of story you tell also depends on the context. So I'd say in the grant proposal, some things work well. I think the tension and the therefore but is very successful. The personalization probably doesn't work so well, and it would be seen as a very subjective and a little bit wishy-washy in a scientific panel. I'd feel if somebody got very personal about their personal journey to come to this idea. So I think some of those ideas apply. So that personalization is great for a public lecture or a class, but perhaps not for a grant proposal. Some of these elements I think apply in certain contexts and not so well in other contexts.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a super important point. And I guess I just go back to the peer review aspect. And the more you can test out when you're applying stories with your peers and colleagues, that's always a good idea. And yeah, maybe some contexts it's inappropriate. So I do agree. But having sat in on some board meetings of funders before, I often see that the board members are kind of frustrated not to have enough stories. They're kind of bored with the data. So maybe having like a section, maybe, yeah, not your personal journey, but there may be room for it, in fact, if it's done appropriately.
Would something like learning from past experience or learning from previous mistakes work in that case? I mean, you don't want to say you've made so many mistakes, but yeah, if you're applying for a grant, but just showing that you're building on experience. And
yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'd be interested others in the call what they think. I guess there's a limit to how much you want to show your mistakes, lest you undermine your own sort of worth. It has to be the right balance. I think if you're showing how those mistakes made you a better researcher, then that is incredibly valuable. But I wouldn't just do your sort of list of every time you messed everything up.
Yeah, definitely. Connie had a question about what they got so wrong in Cats.
Oh, well, it's a good question. I like I said, I actually haven't seen it, but based on what I read, trying to go half animated, half human just freaks people out. Like it's probably like giving Judi Dench a tail just freaked everyone out. But I mean, it is a classic story, which is kind of surprising. Like Cats is such a long running production. So it is kind of surprising, but yeah, I actually, maybe someone who's seen it can probably comment better than I can.
I had a question, Josh. Thank you. This was really, really interesting. When we talk about storytelling, a lot of times what we see, especially in movies, so I'm thinking rom-coms, like one of the things, it's a personal pet peeve of mine, but somehow the female character, right, has to be clumsy, because if she's completely polished and she's good at her job, then people actually don't want her to get romance. So similar to Aladdin needs to steal the bread, but he has to give it to someone. You know, women kind of have, and it's in the media all the time now, right, these double standards. And so do you have any advice for how to craft a story if either the character that you're talking about is female or the person presenting is female versus male, and how to kind of deal with the audience perceptions and things like that so that they connect with that female character?
Yeah, thanks. And sorry about the hammering. Yeah, so
we can't hear.
Oh, you can't hear the hammering. Okay, great.
Not much, no.
Yeah, so obviously this is a super important issue, and Hollywood is going through a major reckoning about gender. And I'm not going to pretend that I can give the exact answer. I would just say it's really important to have diversity of voices contributing, and it seems like there's some progress being made. I saw an interesting article in the New York Times a few months back, someone who was writing about this hero's journey theory and saying, why is the hero always male and why is it always the hero and not the heroine? And I thought that was really interesting and something I hadn't actually thought about before. Yeah, so I don't have a clear answer, but it's super important. I would just say when
on that point, I was a big fan of Joseph Campbell, read him as a PhD student as well. I was quite impressed by his writings. But that hero's journey, it could be seen as a very, this focus on individualism is a very particular way of viewing the world, that the journey goes through this individual path of, the hero goes on this path of individual success and redemption and transforming the world. And it could be argued that that's part of the problem that we have. We have a very individualistic society that doesn't see collective action as heroic in the same way that the individual is seen as heroic. And how do we get around that? Is this embedded, this idea of the individual transforming the world, so embedded in our cultural mindsets of the hero's journey that we find it hard to move beyond that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's perhaps, this, as I said in the beginning, this is a very American Hollywood perspective, and that's an American individualism. That's sort of, well, we don't have to go down a whole road talking about that, but it does raise tension there between sort of focusing on the individual as a storytelling device versus thinking about the collective. I do think the model of the hero's journey can be applied to societies, thinking about writings about resilience and vulnerability. And after, it's something I'm thinking about in my DPhil, after communities go through extreme weather events, how they rebuild better. So that has elements of a journey in there, but I think you're right that the traditional focus is definitely on the individual, often a male.
Elena is just adding in the chat that there was a study a few years ago that showed that both women and men, or girls and boys, relate more to and have more affinity with male characters. So it just shows how powerful our previous experience with stories have been shaping us.
Absolutely. And another big finding from the science communication literature is that the messenger has a huge impact on, like, you give the same message to an audience, and depending on who gives you the message will completely change the outcome. To a certain extent, this makes sense. Like, I'm going to trust news from NPR a lot more than from Fox News, but it also can have backfire effects as well.
I had a quick question about how this might be applied to things like environmental assessment. So things like the IPCC and IPBES are doing a form of storytelling in their reports, but they typically follow a pattern of kind of status and trends, drivers, response options, and there may be kind of scenarios in there as well. To me, I was just trying to kind of go through your list of kind of tips or hints or whatever, and think about whether or not any of those things apply. And I feel like maybe the storytelling in those assessments is not geared towards some of the kind of approaches that you're suggesting.
So you would like to see more adoption of these kinds of principles?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think it's both, it has resonance for communicating the science around biodiversity through environmental assessment processes. But also there's a question about whether or not any of these ideas of narrative storytelling might actually inform the conduct of science itself. So what kinds of questions should we be asking to actually create a more fuller narrative that can communicate biodiversity, the issues with biodiversity in a more kind of compelling way? But I don't think that begins necessarily with, or I don't think it begins necessarily with the science already done, but we could perhaps use some of the tips or ideas about narrative to inform the kinds of questions that we ask so that we can create that fuller story. Yeah, so I don't know, but I was just thinking about how that might apply in the context of assessments.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, thinking about storytelling as part of the research process, so that's great.
Can I ask, Josh, thank you so much for your talks, fantastic. I really
Thank you.
find lots of this stuff very interesting. So I think it was great to listen to. How do you have any tips for how you some of the principles of what you've been going through in the last half hour or so, and apply them in a way that they don't seem cliche or very cheesy? Because obviously these have been, they're principles because they've been done since the dawn of storytelling time. And so how do you make sure you apply them without sort of sounding like I've heard this story before, or it sounds very cheesy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I got kind of like a big critique from someone on my Nature article saying, you essentially want every scientist to give a TED talk. And I said, yes. But yeah, they are cliche, absolutely. And it's manipulative and it can come off, and people really don't like being manipulated. So I think you raise a really good question. I would just refer back to the vulnerability point I made. I think you can sort of poke fun at yourself and say, I thought I'd start out with something dramatic, and so here's me on top of Everest or whatever. I think sort of being transparent can kind of help, not taking yourself too seriously when you use this. Yeah, again, I think testing, practicing, showing it to colleagues or people who represent your target audience is a really good way if you really want to do it well.
Oh, I've got a question from Ima. Thanks for a really great talk. When we give talks or lecture, we aim to engage the audience and create discussion and interactivity. Any tips on how to open discussion points, etc.? How to engage the audience?
Yeah, I'm here, so I can.
Oh, hi. Go ahead, Ima.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Josh.
Thanks.
But I was just wondering, like many times, especially when we give lectures, but also in great talks, the best talks and the best seminars are when, like yesterday, Ruth the Frizz would break and use the audience to bring some point into the discussion and then use them as a therefore but. And I think this is kind of a skill. So I was wondering whether you have been thinking in this plot and what are the best moments in which to introduce that and introduce this interactivity.
And especially on Zoom at the moment.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's challenging, especially these days. It's a really good question, and the interactivity is so important. Something I've been thinking about, sort of experimenting with, is I don't know if you remember the sort of choose your own adventure books when you were a kid or like years ago, or Netflix actually came out with that Black Mirror that you like choose the different options. And I was thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool if a presentation, like the audience could sort of, if you were exploring different outcomes of something, like playing around with story structures in your presentation itself might be kind of interesting. That's a very specific idea, but yeah, I'm afraid I don't know exactly how to make it more interactive, but using stories at least will take people along for a journey rather than just fact after fact after fact.
You could ask the audience if they want to stay in the 1.5 scenario or go to 3 degrees.
Yeah, see, like, what does the world look like under these different scenarios? Well, and another way, of course, going back to the hero's journey, like asking your audience, how does this data I just showed you, how does it make you feel? Does it change your understanding of the world, or does it not? You already, had your beliefs and it doesn't influence them on the topic. Like if in your case, like if you're talking about fires in the Amazon, were you aware of these fires? Do you find this shocking? Things like that, I think. It's really just getting at the human experience of science beyond the science itself. That's all.
Thank you.
I had another question, which is just to challenge you around the so what. So why does it matter that we engage people with stories? Like, what's the point? Yes, we could tell stories, but tell stories better in science and biodiversity and conservation. But like, so what? If, yeah, beyond just kind of, therefore they're going to act in a particular way. I mean, because if that's the answer, then I don't know. Anyway, I'll let you respond and then we can have a discussion.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Well, I've pointed out some of the cases, the studies that they're using storytelling to persuade audiences about vaccines and climate change and other sort of science society issues. So it's useful in that respect. But I would just say not every scientist has to be a communicator. Some scientists just want to stay in the lab, and that's fine. But I do think the scientific enterprise as a whole has a responsibility to engage the public in a way that's accessible, not only because they're giving us tax money, but because it's really important for people to understand evidence-based thinking. And storytelling really, it's just the science, the research is in, and storytelling works. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I guess
that the meta question there is, why do you want to communicate anything you do to anyone else? I'm presuming you do want to do that because for whatever purpose, whether to change policy or just to inform people what you're doing. Then I guess then the thing is, how can storytelling help you be more effective in that communication to get people to listen and pay attention rather than just switch off when you start talking? And especially when there's a barrage of messages and communication all the time that we're faced with, how can your message get through that?
Exactly. And if I could ask a question to all of you, I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on to what extent you think these techniques are appropriate, not when you're speaking with the public, but when you're speaking with your colleagues and experts in your field. Would you use them, or do you think with your own colleagues it's not useful?
I'll maybe respond just to that in relation to the paper and the article I just shared. I think that was a way that a group of scientists who work in these interdisciplinary issues, that they really engaged the readers, and that was in the article, in the paper, as well as, you know, the conversation article around it. And I think even in the paper you managed to, because they're communicating to a scientific audience, I think it makes us scientists also see things potentially in a different way. So using that creativity of storytelling was, I think, quite useful.
Mm.
It was, sorry, the paper was about imagining biodiversity futures, or what futures do we want? So that was the context.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of, I've been seeing a lot more papers about this idea, sort of one researcher refers to it as transformative imagination, and sort of using storytelling to imagine future storylines, and something the IPCC is taking quite seriously, it seems.
Yeah, so the IPCC and IPBES, I wanted to ask actually after Jasper's comment. They've been investing a lot in storytelling and communicating, so that the report itself is very scientific and large, but they have been doing a lot of work on communication and creative storytelling, and I guess investing in it much more than they would have in previous years. Do you know more about that, about where that's going?
I don't know the latest, but I have heard that it's being implemented a lot more.
Okay. I don't know if they have a clear communication strategy and plans for how to do this, or if they're just ad hoc investing in little projects here and there.
I think they have a communication strategy that's negotiated by the governments. There's a kind of firm document, and then they have a communications officer who's applying, I guess, their own expertise in kind of social media and using YouTube and videos and things like that. Yeah, but they're producing podcasts, kind of interview style things with some of the authors, and yeah, and communication videos as well.
And they do TED-Ed videos and things like that, I think.
Yeah, so any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question. Josh, in looking at this here, I can turn my video on if that helps. Hi. I just was wondering, have you come across much research that that sort of looks at these storytelling techniques from a sort of critical social science perspective, as in, you know, because there are, as you raised yourself, you know, sort of more challenging questions. And as the point about, you know, portrayal of women, you know, came up, that, you know, just because somebody can make a good story out of something doesn't necessarily mean that their cause is more really at the end of the day desirable. So I just wonder, because it's not really something that I've explored directly. Have you come across work that looks at the ways that these techniques are used?
You know, not so much actually. I mean, as I said earlier, it is manipulation. It's emotional manipulation, and it could be used for good and bad means. Yeah, no articles are really coming to mind critiquing it, but I think it's actually something really important to think about. So thanks for that.
Right, sure.
Just a personal question, Josh. How are you using this in your own thesis? And what's the thesis focusing on, and how are you using the text?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. Yeah, my thesis is all around, I guess it's really all, I'm using narrative theories as a theoretical framework to look at perceptions of extreme weather events. So there's a lot of studies, over 70 as far as I can count, that ask people, do you believe that extreme event, that flood or that hurricane you experienced was climate change? And that's a very simple way of asking, and it's a yes or a no. But people actually hold complex narratives like around these extreme events and the different causes. So I'm trying to develop a narrative model to break down sort of the nuances of how people engage with these weather events. And, you know, people say climate change. I'm looking at Greenpeace communications right now, and they say fossil fuel industry, whereas others, you know, there's a lot in there, but I'm using this storytelling model to get at more nuance, if that makes sense.
I just wanted to add one quick comment to the so what discussion, which was that in science and technology studies, there's a discussion of creating things that travel and studying things that travel. So I think one thing about narratives is that it's not only communicating to the audience that's necessarily watching that talk, but how do you create a story that they will take away and either share with other people or kind of embed into their understanding of the world. So I think, yeah, I don't know if you want to reflect on that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most fascinating questions here. Why do certain myths and stories last for thousands of years and just keep popping up again and again and again? What is it about those stories that just resonate with us somehow across cultures often? And yeah, that's the question. And if Hollywood knew how to craft a story that was always going to be powerful, I guarantee you they would be using it. I mean, they can't, Hollywood tries to predict through focus groups and otherwise what film or TV show is going to do well. Sometimes they can, sometimes they really can't. But you'll often notice that like one new film will come along that does some new technique or new kind of structure, and then there's a flurry of films after it that follow that same approach. So yeah, everyone's trying to get at the all resonating story. But there are these, as I pointed out, there are these key elements, character growth and things, flaws that across stories tend to resonate with many audiences. And again, that's among a Western audience, and there may be different perspectives in different entertainment industries around the world.
Great. I'm wondering, does anyone else have questions? Josh, you mentioned maybe doing another workshop for students at some point, so we can.
Yeah, usually when I run
this,
when I run this session in the past, I've done it for 2 hours, and we do a more interactive exercise where we actually put these techniques into practice. And I guess if people want to do a more hands-on kind of exercise, I'm happy to do that. If they get in touch with you or me, we can organize that. Happy to do that.
Yeah, I think we'll organize it a bit later in the term, and we'll invite students when they're more settled in.
Great.
I think it'll be popular. There's lots to learn.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for attending. And if I can offer any advice on your sort of personal communications or for your organizations or lab groups, just let me know.
Yes, please.
I need more distractions for my PhD. So.
I'd love you to my lab group, actually, Josh, or mix it up sometime.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Thanks,
okay.
Josh.
Bye.
Bye. Amazing.